Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. Your support helps us bring you more stories like this. Now, let us begin. Emeline Lucy Bates was born in June 1838 in the town of Barre, Vermont. She entered the world during the early Victorian era, a time when rural New England life was defined by agriculture, large families, and physical labor. Emeline was the seventh of 12 children, raised in a crowded household that reflected the norms of mid-19th century American farm families. Daily life revolved around shared responsibilities, with children expected to contribute to household and farm work from an early age. Resources were limited, privacy was rare, and discipline was often strict, shaped by the demands of survival rather than comfort. Growing up in such an environment meant that Emeline was accustomed to long hours of work and constant responsibility. Domestic duties, food preparation, cleaning, and helping with agricultural tasks were part of everyday life. Education, where available, was secondary to labor, and opportunities for individual advancement were few, particularly for girls. The social expectations placed upon young women emphasized obedience, endurance, and preparation for marriage and motherhood, rather than personal independence. In 1857, at the age of 18, Emeline married Horace Mika. Horace was a young farm laborer who traveled from town to town seeking seasonal work. His livelihood depended on short-term agricultural employment, which offered little financial security and required frequent relocation. After their marriage, Emeline joined Horace in this itinerant lifestyle. Rather than remaining near her family home, she moved with him as he followed available farm work, often laboring alongside him in the fields. This period marked the beginning of Emeline's adult life, defined by marriage, physical labor, and economic uncertainty. These early circumstances formed the foundation upon which the later events of her life would unfold. Following their marriage, Emeline and Horace Mika attempted to establish a more settled life. In 1858, they briefly settled in Plainfield, Vermont, where Emeline gave birth to their first child, a daughter named Nellie. During this period, the couple managed to purchase a modest home, an achievement that suggested hope for stability after years of traveling for work. Emeline focused on caring for her infant daughter, while continuing to manage household responsibilities expected of a farm wife in rural Vermont. In 1859, the family welcomed a second child, a son named Cecil. Despite the growing household, their stay in Plainfield proved short-lived. By 1860, Emeline and Horace sold their property and returned to Barre, Vermont. There, Horace worked alongside Emeline's father, who owned a small farm. Emeline, now responsible for two young children, concentrated on maintaining the household while supporting the farm's daily operations through domestic and agricultural labor. In 1861, Emeline gave birth to their third child, a son named Almon Lewis. The family's brief period of growth was soon overshadowed by tragedy. In October of that year, young Cecil contracted diphtheria, a highly feared illness commonly referred to at the time as a children's plague. The disease was frequently fatal for children under 5 years old. Cecil died before reaching his second birthday, leaving the family deeply affected by the loss. The following year brought further disruption. In 1862, Horace Mika enlisted in the Civil War. His departure marked the beginning of an extended period of physical strain and emotional hardship for Emeline, as she faced the responsibilities of motherhood and survival without her husband. This absence permanently reshaped daily family life. With Horace Mika away serving in the Civil War, Emeline was left to manage her family's survival largely on her own. During this period, she assumed responsibility for her father's farm while continuing to care for her young children. The work was physically demanding and unrelenting. Emeline plowed fields, planted crops, shoveled manure, and hauled heavy buckets of sap used in her father's sugar farming operation. These tasks, typically performed by multiple laborers, fell to her daily for more than 2 years. The labor required strength and endurance and left little time for rest. In May 1864, Horace returned home from the war. Although he survived a conflict that claimed the lives of more than 5,000 Vermont soldiers, his health had been permanently affected. He was physically weakened and suffered from chronic ailments that limited his ability to work consistently. Over the following years, his condition continued to deteriorate, and by the 1870s he had lost most of his hearing. Emeline experienced a similar decline, as her own hearing gradually worsened during this period. Medical theories later suggested that the shared hearing loss suffered by both Horace and Emeline may have been caused by syphilis, a disease Horace was believed to have contracted during his military service and unknowingly passed on to his wife. These theories were noted but not conclusively proven. Despite these challenges, the family attempted to rebuild stability. Using Horace's military pension, they secured a mortgage on a farm near Duxbury Corner. By this time, their daughter Nellie had grown up and moved away to begin her own life. Their son Almon remained at home, assisting Emeline with farm labor as Horace's health continued to decline. In 1879, new members were introduced into the Mika household under troubling circumstances. Horace Mika received a letter concerning his much younger half-siblings, Alice and Henry Mika. Their mother, Mary Mika, Horace's stepmother, was no longer able to care for them. As a result, the children had been placed in an orphanage. The institution was overcrowded, underfunded, and responsible for a mixed population that included orphans and individuals with disabilities. Resources were limited, and conditions were harsh. Alice, born in August 1870, and formally named Mary Jane but commonly called Alice, struggled to adapt to the orphanage environment. She was described as spirited and defiant, traits that brought her into frequent conflict with overseers who found her behavior difficult to manage. Henry, born in July 1872, was younger and more subdued. He adjusted more easily and attracted less attention. The strain of caring for many children with limited support made Alice's presence particularly unwelcome. Desperate to reduce the burden, the orphanage overseer contacted Horace Mika. He proposed that the town would provide a small payment if Horace agreed to take Alice and Henry into his home and raise them until adulthood. Although the amount offered was modest, the children represented additional labor that could help with the demands of farm life. Horace accepted the arrangement without consulting his wife, Emeline. On May 5, 1879, Alice and Henry were brought to the town, where Horace collected them and took them to his farm near Duxbury Corner. Their arrival immediately created tension. Emeline, already burdened by years of labor and responsibility, had not agreed to the arrangement and viewed the children as unwanted obligations. Her resentment was particularly directed toward Alice. Life inside the Mika household quickly became harsh for Alice Mika. Emeline Mika showed open hostility toward the young girl, treating her not as family but as an unwanted burden. Punishments were frequent and severe. For even minor infractions, Emeline struck Alice with the handle of a broom, delivering blows that left the child fearful and injured. Over time, the abuse escalated beyond physical violence. Emeline began withholding food from Alice, leaving her hungry, weakened, and increasingly vulnerable. The deprivation compounded the physical punishments and further isolated the child within the household. Henry Mika experienced a markedly different treatment. Quiet and obedient by nature, he avoided much of Emeline's anger by following instructions closely and drawing as little attention to himself as possible. His compliance allowed him to blend into the background, while Alice's spirited behavior repeatedly placed her in conflict with Emeline's authority. This contrast further intensified Alice's position as the primary target of abuse. The Mika family's neighbors, Charles Amington and his teenage daughter Jeannie, lived nearby in a house rented on the Mika property. Both witnessed signs of the mistreatment. On one occasion, Jeannie was home alone when she heard a piercing scream that sounded like a young girl, followed by repeated thudding noises. She believed the sounds indicated another beating. Charles Amington personally observed Emeline beating Alice and heard her threaten to whip the child to death. These incidents were not isolated. Other members of the local community also witnessed acts of cruelty toward Alice. Despite their awareness, no one intervened. Whether due to fear, indifference, or the social norms of the time, the abuse continued unchecked. The community's inaction allowed the mistreatment of Alice Mika to persist until her sudden disappearance. On the morning of Saturday, April 24th, 1880, Alice Mika was discovered missing from the Mika household. Horace Mika was the first to notice her absence and asked his wife if she knew where the girl had gone. Emeline appeared unconcerned and casually replied that Alice must have taken some clothes and run away during the night. The explanation unsettled Horace, but he did not immediately challenge her account. Unknown to Emeline, he had already arranged for another family to take Alice in, believing that removing her from the hostile environment would give her a better life. As the hours passed with no sign of the child, Horace suggested searching for her. Emeline dismissed the idea, insisting that waiting was best, and that searching would be pointless if Alice had truly run away. Her lack of concern and refusal to act struck Horace as unusual. Throughout the day, neighbors began asking questions as word of Alice's disappearance spread. When pressed, Emeline gave vague and inconsistent explanations, sometimes stating Alice had run away, and at other times claiming she did not know where the girl was. Almon Mika was also questioned, and his account of the previous evening did not match his mother's statements. As both spoke, their stories increasingly conflicted, with small discrepancies becoming more apparent. These contradictions, combined with Emeline's insistence that no search be conducted, heightened suspicion among the neighbors. Community members were already uneasy due to Emeline's history of mistreating Alice. Given the girl's frail condition and lack of resources, many doubted she could survive on her own. Concern deepened into alarm, leading locals Jacob Foss and EBA Huntley to report the situation to Deputy Sheriff Frank Ainsworth, prompting official involvement. On April 26, 1880, law enforcement officers arrived at the Mika home to investigate Alice Mika's disappearance. Emeline Mika and her son Almon initially repeated the claim that Alice had run away and denied any knowledge of her whereabouts. Officers quickly observed Emeline's domineering influence over her son and decided to question Almon separately. He was taken to the office of E.F. Palmer, where he was removed from his mother's presence. Once alone, Almon broke down and confessed. He told officers that his mother had grown increasingly resentful of Alice, viewing her as an unbearable burden. According to Almon, Emeline stated that Alice would be better off dead. He described how she first suggested abandoning the girl in the wilderness, but dismissed the idea as too risky. Instead, she devised a plan to poison her. Almon said his mother sent him to purchase strychnine from a pharmacy and to rent a carriage. On the night of April 23rd, Almon and Emeline waited until Alice was asleep. They removed her from her bed, placed a sack over her head, and transported her by carriage to a nearby stream. There, Emeline mixed the poison into a drink and forced Alice to consume it. The child convulsed violently before dying. They then traveled several miles to a swampy area where they buried her in a shallow grave. Almon led officers to the burial site. When the body was exhumed, bruises from the struggle were visible. Transporting the remains proved difficult because the buggy was too small, forcing Almon to hold the body upright during the journey. The following day, Almon retracted his confession, claiming he acted alone. Despite this, both he and Emeline Mika were formally charged with murder. On May 10, 1880, Emeline and Almon Mika appeared before the court in Waterbury for their preliminary hearing. The public reaction was immediate and hostile, with community members expressing anger and outrage over Alice Mika's disappearance and the allegations of abuse. The courtroom was filled with observers, reflecting widespread interest in the case and concern over the fate of the young girl. During the hearing, Dr. August Whithouse, a professor of chemistry at the University of Vermont, presented findings from Alice's autopsy. His testimony confirmed that strychnine had been ingested, providing definitive evidence that her death was caused by poisoning. The medical report supported suspicions that the child's disappearance and subsequent death had been deliberate, rather than accidental, or the result of her running away. In addition to the scientific evidence, multiple witnesses testified about the abuse Alice had endured while living in the Mika household. Accounts detailed the physical punishment inflicted by Emeline, the use of implements to strike the child, and the repeated threats and deprivation she suffered. Witnesses described seeing Alice frightened, injured, and pleading for mercy, painting a consistent picture of a household in which the girl was regularly mistreated. The cumulative testimony undermined initial claims that Alice had disappeared voluntarily. The combination of forensic evidence and eyewitness accounts established a strong basis for formal charges. After hearing from more than a dozen witnesses, the court determined there was sufficient cause to commit both Emeline and Almon Mika to stand trial. Proceedings for the trial were scheduled to begin on November 22, 1880, setting the stage for a full examination of the evidence and testimony in the upcoming legal process. The joint trial of Emeline and Almon Mika began on November 22, 1880. Both defendants appeared in court, with Emeline presenting a composed appearance that contrasted sharply with her previously haggard look at arrest. She was neatly dressed, wearing gloves, and her demeanor was calm. Almon sat beside her, also dressed formally, appearing weak yet composed, holding his mother's hand as they had done during the preliminary hearing. Early in the proceedings, Almon, following discussions with his defense attorneys, changed his plea to guilty. This left Emeline to face the jury alone, while her legal team attempted to shift responsibility entirely onto her son. The defense argued that Almon had carried out the murder independently, portraying him as the sole instigator and Emeline as unaware of his actions. They suggested she had no knowledge of the violent act and had not participated in planning or executing it. This strategy was intended to absolve her of responsibility, depicting her as a mother uninvolved in the crime despite her presence. Witnesses presented detailed accounts of Emeline's long-standing abuse of Alice. Charles Amington described observing physical punishment, threats to whip her to death, and harsh reprimands. Another witness, Henry, recounted seeing Alice struck, grabbed by the hair, chased across the fields, and otherwise mistreated. Mrs. E. Huntley testified to the child's isolation and cheerless existence. These accounts directly contradicted the defense's portrayal, showing consistent cruelty leading up to the murder. Emeline took the stand in her own defense, recounting her difficult childhood, the loss of her son Cecil, her husband's departure to war, and years of grueling labor. However, her testimony regarding the events of April 23, 1880, was inconsistent and evasive. The jury noted contradictions and a lack of clarity in her account of the night of Alice's death. After deliberation, the jury found Emeline Lucy Mika guilty of Alice's murder. Both she and her son Almon were sentenced to death, concluding the trial phase of the case. Following the conviction, appeals were filed on behalf of both Emeline and Almon Mika. Almon provided a detailed confession while in custody, explaining the growing resentment his mother had harbored toward Alice and the influence she exerted over him. His account was used to argue that he had acted under his mother's domination and was not the primary instigator of the crime. Legal advocates emphasized these points in an appeal, seeking reconsideration of his death sentence. The appeals process led to a commutation of Almon's sentence. His punishment was reduced to life imprisonment, reflecting the court's acceptance that his mother's influence had played a significant role in the events leading to Alice's death. This decision closed a portion of the case that had captivated the public and raised questions about the interplay of familial authority, coercion, and culpability in criminal actions. Emeline Lucy Mika's appeal, however, was unsuccessful. On March 30, 1883, at 1:30 p.m., she was executed by hanging. The event drew an audience of 125 people who witnessed the legal execution. When asked if she had any final words, Emeline addressed the crowd, stating, "May God forgive you all for hanging me, an innocent woman," and pointed to the deputy sheriff, claiming she was as innocent as he was. None of her family members were present for the execution, and her body was not claimed after death. Emeline Mika was buried in the Ascutney Cemetery in Windsor County, Vermont. Her execution marked a historical first, as she became the first woman to be legally executed in the state. The case, spanning years of investigation, trial, and appeals, highlighted the severity of child abuse, the legal responsibility of guardians, and the public scrutiny surrounding capital punishment in Vermont during the late 19th century. It also closed a chapter that had left a lasting impact on the community and on the historical record of criminal proceedings in the region.